Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, and thanks to those who are on the Zoom and those who watch tonight's talk elsewhere on YouTube or on our website or wherever. So Ross McMullin makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. I think he's been here on 2 other occasions. There was a book on Pompey Elliott, a book on Will Dyson, the artist, his previous book, and there are copies of it here tonight, Farewell, Dear People, Biographies of Australia's Lost Generation, and tonight on the occasion of the recent release of the sort of follow-up of that book, Life So Full of Promise, Further Biographies of Australia's Lost Generation. Now that book's been nominated, I understand, for the very important literary award, the Moran Award in the NIB Awards, which are based in Sydney. Where are they again? Well, Waverley, yeah. But very prestigious award, so it's quite appropriate that Ross McMullin's here tonight to talk on this book, A Life So Full of Promise. We describe him as a war historian, an author of many biographies, and this is the most recent one. So World War I and the Lost Generation. You're very welcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks very much, Gerard. Life So Full of Promise, as Gerard said, is my second multi-biography about Australia's lost generation of World War I, following Farewell, Dear People, which was published in 2012. Both books contain a collection of interwoven family stories about extraordinary Australians who had become unknown. Each story establishes the outstanding pre-war potential of one of the main characters, describes what happened to him during the conflict, and underlines the profound consequences for his nation as well as for his family in the aftermath. And with the families and friends of the main characters also conspicuous in the narratives, Life So Full of Promise emulates Farewell, Dear People in providing insights into the experiences of Australians in the period before, during and after the war, whether they were combatants or civilians or soldiers' wives or parents. A lot happens in the stories, so this talk will just scratch the surface of what's in the book. First up is the sprawling family saga of the Pockleys. This is Frank Pockley, a distinguished ophthalmologist who lived at Wahroonga with his wife Ellie and their 5 children. Frank supervised the construction of this grand residence called Greystanes at Wahroonga, and it's still there today, and his children grew up there. The eldest was Phyllis and the youngest was Nell, while the middle 3 were all boys. The eldest son on the right is Guy. His brother Jack is on the left, and the middle brother in the photo is Brian. The brothers went to school at Shaw. Brian excelled in the classroom and at sport. He was the star of the family. He achieved better results in his junior matric exams than any Shaw student had ever recorded, and as an exceptionally swift runner, he excelled at rugby as well as athletics. He won the Shaw Athletics Championship with a record points tally and led the rugby team superbly through an undefeated season that enabled Shaw to win the school's championship for the very first time. Here's that premiership team, with Brian in the middle holding the football, and in the back row, his brother Jack is on the far right, while third from left and arrestingly tall is the Pockleys' close friend Jack Massey, who was on his way to becoming the most versatile top-level sportsman Australia has ever known. Brian Pockley was distinguished not only by his outstanding achievements. His temperament was also revered. He was ethical and diligent, but he was also amiable and considerate, engaging and companionable, helpful and obliging, unassertive and unpretentious, with unostentatious charm. He was a high achiever without being driven. The headmaster of Shaw declared that Brian was as near to my ideal schoolboy as any boy in my experience. His unusually endearing personality ensured that he was also immensely popular at university. He graduated in medicine with honours, he continued to excel in athletics, and his dashing pace resulted in a series of thrilling tries for Uni's rugby team that led to his selection at interstate level for New South Wales. Sydney Hospital selected the best graduates for its resident doctors, and Brian began work there in 1914. A few months later, when international tensions erupted in Europe, no one in Australia was keener to be involved in the looming conflict than Brian Pockley. He was so keen that he raced out to Victoria Barracks in Sydney to volunteer before Britain had even declared war. That is, before there was a war for Australia to be in. Soon enough, though, Britain did declare war. As a result, Australia was involved, and Brian was appointed as a doctor in one of the Australian forces that was quickly formed. Everyone here will have some familiarity with Australia's main force, the AIF, which later, of course, became involved at Gallipoli and the Western Front. But early in the war, a separate, lesser-known Australian force was created, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, or ANMEF. It was to depart as soon as possible to destroy German wireless stations to Australia's north. Brian became one of the ANMEF's doctors. The ANMEF leaders complacently decided that a very small force was all that was needed to go ashore at New Guinea, southeast of Rabaul, to deal with a German wireless station that might be there. They presumed that enemy resistance would be non-existent or minimal. Brian was chosen to accompany them as their doctor. Here's a painting depicting them going ashore on the 11th of September 1914. That is only a month or so after Australia became involved in the war and more than 7 months before Gallipoli. And what they headed into proved a much tougher assignment than expected. The way inland was along a narrow track with thick jungle on both sides. Germans and New Guineans were waiting to ambush them from positions such as those in the foreground. The Australians, instead of presenting themselves as a convenient target along the track, decided to try to force their way through the jungle beside the track, which proved very difficult. Shooting began and a sharp skirmish ensued. Pockley, the doctor, was up ahead with the advancing Australians. With a captured German soldier bleeding dangerously from a wounded hand, Pockley expertly amputated the hand on the spot without an anaesthetic. He then heard that an Australian had been wounded, went back to look for him, found him, confirmed that he was dying and looked after him as best he could, and then set off along the narrow track back to the fighting up ahead, only to be shot and fatally wounded himself. Now here's Brian under a pith helmet being conveyed to the ship where he died shortly afterwards. Here he is. He was 24. The reaction to his death was unique. No Australian casualty in the whole war was mourned more deeply than Brian Pockley. Big statement, but I'm sure it's correct. Why? Why was this? This was partly because of his own special qualities, which I've outlined, partly because it occurred so early in the war when there had not been years of heavy casualties to transform perceptions, and partly because of the particular circumstances, in that he was a non-combatant who was presumed not to be vulnerable, but he had in fact given his protective brassard, or armband with a badge on it, he'd given away his protective brassard, indicating his medical role to the sturdy stoker who carried the wounded man back that Brian had treated. The stoker had queried this, but Brian had selflessly insisted on relinquishing his brassard, and Brian was an officer and the stoker was not. When the manner of Brian's death became known in Australia, Brian's father, Frank, together with Brian's best friend, who was to become a High Court judge, and numerous other admirers declared that such a gesture was absolutely characteristic of Brian, just what they would have expected he would have done. Brian Pockley became a household name in Australia, with the manner of his death widely known, but he is long forgotten today. Now, a quick whip through other elements of the Pockley story that I haven't time to dwell on this evening. This is Brian's sister Phyllis, who married a British naval officer, and during the war she became extremely anxious about her husband's perilous exploits in the North Sea, with good reason, because they were absolutely amazing. Also, Brian's parents split up shortly before the war, which had profound ramifications for the family. Brian's brother Guy decided that he would never speak to his father Frank again, and he was relentless. Softening a grudge was not in his repertoire. And when a bohemian Scandinavian blonde disrupted the Pockley family after the war, Guy evidently concluded, incorrectly, that Frank had been the father of her children. And Guy even went so far as to arrange for one of them to be removed from the Shore School. And in a separate development, Brian's closest confrere during his medical course was sensationally shot dead in Sydney when he seemed on the verge of being selected for the Australian Test cricket team. So a lot does happen in the stories, and they are pretty eventful. This is Brian's younger brother, Jack Pockley, an admired AIF officer who also died in heroic circumstances. When he was hit in March 1918, he directed the stretcher bearers to take away a wounded sergeant first, and when they returned to Jack, they found him dead. He was 26. The brothers had died 3.5 years apart, but parallels were understandably drawn about the similarly selfless circumstances of their deaths. There are 2 distinctive memorials to the brothers in the Shore School Chapel. This is the Brian Pockley Memorial window, and this is the magnificent Jack Pockley Memorial organ. Here's a poignant photo of their father, long after the war, alone in his den at Wahroonga, surrounded by photos of his loved ones. Most of them he'd lost in one way or another. I'd now like to talk about Norman Calloway. Norman's background was starkly different from Brian Pockley's. While the Pockleys were affluent, the Calloways were not. While the Pockleys were urban, the Calloways were rural. While Brian Pockley grew up in an imposing North Shore mansion, Norman Calloway lived in a basic weatherboard cottage on the edge of town. While Brian's parents were invited to select dinners attended by patrician governors, this was an inconceivable milieu for the Calloways. While Brian's father was an instinctive political conservative, Norman's father co-founded a branch of the Labor Party. While it was routine for the Pockleys to go to university, provided they were male, this was unthinkable for the Calloways. Norman grew up in the Riverina at Hay, a town founded on the Murrumbidgee River with his parents and his sister Jessie. This typical scene near Hay shows the ambience Norman was familiar with, although this tranquility could be deceptive. Parents of young children had a relentless dread of the danger the river posed. Drownings happened disturbingly often. They included, in the Calloways' time there, one of Norman's cousins, one of his teachers, and a nephew of a Victorian Premier. The Calloways were very keen on sport, and Norman emerged as a highly talented cricketer. His parents decided to move the family to Sydney in 1912 to give young Norm the opportunity to develop his cricket and see how far his talent could take him. Here's Norman aged 16, soon after his arrival in the metropolis. He progressed rapidly in Sydney. Playing for Paddington in the first grade competition, his first game was against none other than Victor Trumper, the legendary batsman who was probably, in my view, the most adored Australian athlete of all time. And in Norm's third match, 17-year-old Norm made an arresting breakthrough century of high quality that attracted rave reviews. This photo of him was published after that brilliant innings, and he looks very young again, doesn't he? Norm progressed so rapidly that he was soon seen as a candidate for higher honours, and only 15 months after he left Hay, he was 12th man for this New South Wales team in February 1914 when he was still only 17. Norm is front right in the photo, bearing in mind he's 12th man. Didn't play, but he's in there as 12th man, with the Pockleys' friend Jack Massey, who had become the best bowler in Australia, second from left in the middle row alongside the diminutive champion Charlie McCartney, who's the captain in the centre of the middle row. Before the following season, Norm's family moved from Paddington to nearby Waverley, so he had to change clubs, and here he is with his new team, sitting at the far right of the middle row. Far right of the middle row. Now, my Callaway story covers a number of facets, just like the Pockley one does, outside the life story of the main character, and the facets affecting things more broadly in the Callaway story, affecting cricket and cricketers during this era, listing a few of them very briefly, are these. The bitter split between Australia's test players and the administrators seeking to control them, which culminated in the withdrawal of 6 top players from the 1912 Ashes tour to England. So this is the biggest stoush at top-level Australian cricket till the Packer incursion in the 1970s. Also in the book, the prolonged, fierce, physical fight that erupted between Australia's test captain and one of his fellow selectors, which did not end until others intervened when the captain seemed poised to pitch his antagonist through a third-floor window. What do you reckon today's media would make of that? And also covered in the book is the invention of a new kind of deception for bowlers, which came to be known as the googly or wrong-un. Out the back of the hand here. Yeah. So what I've done with Callaway is what I've done with all the main characters in both my Lost Generation multi-biographies, Farewell Dear People and this one, Life So Full of Promise, and that is to put myself in their shoes as much as possible. With Norman, I've aimed to illuminate what it's like to be a talented cricketer who is striving to play at the highest level because he sees the national game as the way to make a fulfilling success of his life. What's it like to have to handle the inevitable ups and downs? What's it like to face the fastest bowling without the protective equipment that we take for granted these days? What's it feel like to be in form and on top of the bowling? What's it feel like to be in form and on top of the bowling, yet make a dopey error and get yourself out? What's that like? In February 1915, when Norman was 18, he was selected to make his debut at first-class level for New South Wales against Queensland. So he's really playing this time, at 18. His captain was Charlie McCartney, the remarkable virtuoso whose admirers were claiming he was not only the finest batsman in Australia, but perhaps even the best in the world at that time. Queensland batted first and were all out for 137. In reply, New South Wales were in big trouble at 3 for 17 when Norm came in. He was initially careful, which was appropriate in his team's situation, but later unfurled a series of glorious strokes as he raced to a brilliant century. Callaway and McCartney had a record partnership of 256, and Norm turned his superb debut 100 into a double century before he was eventually dismissed for 207. I'll just repeat the essence of this exceptional feat. That is, he came in to make his first-class debut at 18 years of age with the score 3 for 17 and proceeded to make a brilliant 207. This wonderful innings was rapturously acclaimed. It was not only the score itself, which was hailed as the world record score on first-class debut, which it was, but also the way he made it, not via crude slogging T20 style aided by plentiful luck, but by a succession of authentic, stylish cricket strokes of the highest quality. And the comparison with McCartney, the commanding dasher who was known as the Governor-General, was extraordinary. This is McCartney in a later match enrapturing the SCG crowd during a test against England. McCartney was renowned for his aggressive exploits of dazzling stroke play, someone who routinely scored more quickly than his batting partners. Not with Callaway, though. When Norman had progressed into his 40s and felt that he had his eye in, the 18-year-old novice strolled down the pitch during one of those between-overs conversations that batsmen have, and he said to McCartney that he felt capable of accelerating. I love McCartney's response. The Governor-General said, "You go right ahead, son. I'll keep my end up." Callaway's acceleration was so rapid that he raced from 48 to 85 in 6 overs while McCartney scored just 3 singles. Norm's first 50 took him 67 minutes, which was good going in the circumstances with his team in trouble, but his second 50 lasted only 27 minutes. He proceeded well beyond his century in the time that McCartney took to reach 50. There were extenuating circumstances with McCartney feeling a bit seedy, but Callaway's brilliance was a revelation. A new star had emerged who was widely seen as a future Test champion. As one newspaper observed, quoting, "Callaway's masterful and brilliant batting against Queensland caused more talk and excited more outside interest than anything that has happened in cricket for some time." And some admirers were so thrilled by Norm's special feat that they arranged for it to be commemorated with this unique trophy. The inscription says, "Presented to Mr. Norman Callaway by a few admirers in recognition of his world's record score of 207 by a colt on his first appearance in first-class cricket." However, everything changed for Norm when casualties at Gallipoli began to rise. So you might remember I said that spectacular innings took place in the match in February 1915. 2 months later, landings at Anzac and casualties at Gallipoli begin to rise. The New South Wales Cricket Association responded by abruptly cancelling first-class cricket. Its Victorian equivalent wanted matches to continue, but the New South Wales administrators were adamant. They insisted that cricketers should be in khaki and maintained this attitude explicitly. Players like Norm were under constant pressure. It was reiterated in a variety of implicit and explicit ways that volunteering was the right and manly thing to do. The Callaways had moved to Sydney to see how far Norm's cricket talent could take him, and it all proceeded wonderfully, even better than they could have hoped. But the war and the attitude to it adopted by the New South Wales cricket administrators had transformed everything. Norm had been deprived of his cherished cricket goal, and he was under relentless pressure. He decided to enlist in 1916. Whoops. There. And that's on the cover of the book. Norm's parents evidently didn't want him to because he lied about his age. He said he was 21, whereas in fact he'd just turned 20. Norm's parents and sister Jessie all ended up living to at least their late 80s, and none of them gave the impression to others that Norm had enlisted from ardent patriotism or king and country sentiment. Indeed, if he had been imbued with such views, he would presumably have enlisted earlier. Callaway had a very grim ordeal in the 19th AIF Battalion. He arrived at the Western Front in time for the 1916-17 winter, which was the most severe in France for decades, and he endured the worst of the Western Front for several months. His unit was then involved in the Second Battle of Bullecourt, where the performance of the higher leadership, both British and Australian, was poor, and the 19th Battalion suffered the consequences. Private Norman Callaway, like so many others, was killed. Now, this tranquil scene is the Bullecourt battlefield a century on, with the village of Riancourt ahead. So Riancourt straight ahead, Bullecourt itself, village away to the left as you look at that. Norman died in the immediate vicinity, probably in the foreground of that photo. The sense of loss was profound. Norm's parents and sister never recovered. But in his case, because of his cricket potential, the sense of loss extended far beyond his family. Cricket pundits and fans were devastated. Analysts repeatedly lamented that Australia had lost a budding champion. This is Norman's sister, Jessie. A relative of the Callaways, a chap named Tony, told me that when he was a teenager in the 1960s, he spoke to Jessie about Norm. The way she talked about Norm made a big impression on Tony. She spoke in excited and affectionate terms about how talented he was, how wonderful it would have been to see him fulfil his destiny, and how distressing it was when he died. Cricket had been important to her because it was important to him. She enjoyed it because he was so good at it. Jessie was enthusing about her brother and his rare skill, as if her fervent delight was something fresh and vivid, yet he had perished half a century earlier. Norman has a unique place in international cricket heritage. No one else has scored a double century in his only first-class innings, and no one else has come close to his career average of 207. However, he is practically unknown today. He should certainly be better remembered. Another conspicuous example of Australia's lost generation is Murdoch Mackay from Bendigo, who was widely known as Doc. This is his famous grandfather, who became a minister in Victorian governments. Doc's father, George, who's standing second from right here, was the Bendigo Advertiser's outstanding editor for decades during its heyday. Doc Mackay was a precociously brilliant student. He began his law course at Melbourne Uni when he had just turned 16 and completed it by coming top in final year, attaining a first-class honours degree, winning the prestigious Supreme Court Judges Prize and becoming eligible for the Master of Laws degree, all having just turned 20. The law professor concluded that in almost 2 decades at Melbourne Uni, he had taught no abler student. During his final year at university, Doc met 18-year-old Margot Watson of the Melbourne suburb of Elstonwick. Margot had 2 sisters, and here's a photo of them as young girls. Left to right, Margot, Nell, and Kath, the eldest. Doc was attracted to Margot, and the Mackays became good friends with the Watson sisters. Here they are holidaying together at Lake's Entrance in January 1911. Doc Mackay, lower left, Margot, second from right. Doc quickly became head over heels in love with Margot, and he was an emotionally open sort of a bloke, so he had no qualms about frankly saying so. A few months after meeting Margot, relatively short time, he wrote her a letter assuring her he was in love with her. Margot, unfortunately for Doc, did not reciprocate with the same intensity. She liked him and was flattered by his ardent interest, but she was not willing to close off her options with an exclusive commitment when she was only 18. Doc had to remain patient and resort to playing a long game to win her over, which he found increasingly difficult. Here's Doc between Margot above and Nell Watson below, and you might be able to see Nell holding his pipe. Now, the eldest Watson sister, Kath Watson, took this photo only a week after 20-year-old Doc accomplished a notable sporting feat when he top scored with a fine innings for Bendigo in its match against the touring English Test side of 1911-12. Came out here that season. Having completed his articles, Doc began as a barrister and did not take long to distinguish himself. After only 2 years at the bar, he was briefed to appear in one of the most notable cases in Australian legal history, which became known as the Wheat case. His interest in politics was confirmed when he involved himself in the 1913 referenda campaign. How topical is that? Addressing meetings and writing articles. 1913. Doc also served in the militia for several years. When World War I began, Doc Mackay had been in love with Margot for 4 years and was still waiting for her to commit. He told her that he had to join the AIF, being a fit and trained officer who believed in the appropriateness of Australia's involvement, or his self-respect would never recover. He insisted, and she accepted, that this in no way signified any lessening of the intensity of his feelings for her. There's a lot in the book about the ups and downs of their relationship. The prospect of his imminent departure seemed to galvanise things for Margot, though, and she agreed to their engagement. And then, in May 1915, only a week before Doc's departure with the AIF, they decided in a great rush to get married, which they did. This is a pouch that Margot created with her initials on it for Doc to keep her letters in while he was away. And this is a photo of Margot that Doc took away with him in the actual case that he carried it around in while he was in the trenches. Doc was in the 22nd Battalion, initially as a captain and later a major. He proved to be an outstanding officer, brave and decisive, inspiring and selfless. He was also the battalion's champion letter writer, renowned for the hours he devoted to long love letters to Margot. These words that Margot wrote on the back of her photo: "My very dear husband, with all the love in the world from your brownie forever," revived Doc's morale when he was acutely homesick. There's Doc in uniform. The 22nd Battalion occupied the trenches opposite Johnson's Jolly on the 2nd Ridge at Gallipoli from September to the evacuation, and the book covers Doc's experiences from their tense arrival at Anzac to their nerve-wracking departure. They returned to Egypt and were then transported to the main arena, the Western Front, where the 22nd was used in various roles and frontline circumstances that the book describes. At this parade in France, when Doc acted as deputy leader of his battalion, the men were addressed by Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who is on the platform on the left, with behind him his predecessor as PM, Andrew Fisher, wearing a white coat, and also between them on the platform is the AIF Commander, General Birdwood. In July 1916, the 22nd Battalion, like other AIF units, was transferred to the Somme, where Doc and his men took part in 2 big battles near what used to be Pozières. The first was a disastrous failure overall, though successful on the left, where Doc was, but when they tackled the whole operation again, it proved a success, thanks primarily to Doc's outstanding leadership. No less an authority than the official historian, Charles Bean. Some of you here will have a sense of who he is. He's an outstanding military historian. No less an authority than Charles Bean declared that Mackay's brilliant leadership at a critical stage enabled the Australians to attain with this victory their most momentous success of the whole Somme campaign, which involved lots of battles. His brilliant leadership at a critical stage enabled the Australians to attain with this victory their most momentous success of the whole Somme campaign. This was remarkable praise, but when I looked into it, thoroughly deserved. However, while Doc was displaying this superb leadership, he was killed in the process. Weeks later, Margot received this remarkable farewell love letter, which Doc had arranged for an AIF friend to send her if he died. There are few more conspicuous examples of Australia's lost generation than Doc Mackay. Some of those who knew him best felt he could well have become Prime Minister. As with the other stories, the book covers other interesting characters and episodes. There's a lot about Doc's mother, Mary, who was a prominent Bendigo identity renowned for her charitable activities, her political activism, and her dynamic leadership of the Red Cross at Bendigo during the war. Doc's younger brother, Eric, who was with him at Pozières, became a doctor and also the first Australian to win the Ireland Tennis Championship. Also covered is a remarkable episode. Doc became involved in a fierce dispute between two of his AIF superiors that bizarrely culminated in a formal court of inquiry conducted at Gallipoli shortly before the evacuation. So not far from the frontline trenches, had this amazing formal court of inquiry. And this extraordinary episode is practically unknown today. And I unexpectedly discovered while researching the Mackays that one of them, a keen cricketer, was selected in an Australian test team to tour England but did not go, and for a surprising reason. There's also a lot in the book about Margot's sister, Nell Watson, and her fiancé, Mac Gibbs, a medical student and VFL footballer who was killed in France shortly before Doc Mackay. Now, if I could just close with a little final anecdote. A story about the research for Life So Full of Promise. Retrieving these forgotten lives that are unknown today involves immense research, as you'll appreciate. Now, with Doc Mackay, I was naturally curious to try and find out what happened to Margot. What happened to Margot after Doc's death? Might she have had a longer life than Doc? Perhaps much longer. Maybe I could find out more about Doc from people who knew her. What I did find out was that Margot became Mrs. S. Hill of London. This was not a very encouraging discovery for a Melbourne-based biographer, and I felt pessimistic about my prospects of finding out more about her. I remember thinking, geez, good luck with that. But I had a go. Hours of genealogical research began to pay dividends. It gradually became evident that Margot and her second husband, Solly Hill, Mrs. S. Hill, Margot and her second husband, Solly Hill, had a daughter who was known as Judy. Moreover, Judy had married a naval officer from WA who was based in London during World War II, and after the conflict they'd settled in Australia. Further ferreting revealed that not only was Judy apparently still alive at an advanced age, but also residing in a Melbourne suburb. I live in a Melbourne suburb. This seemed incredible after my pessimism about ever being able to connect with Margot. Even better, when I did visit Judy, I found that she had retrieved for me a black tin box containing everything Margot had kept for all those decades about Doc, including his arrestingly frank letters. The contents of that box proved to be remarkable. The richest private treasure trove I've ever encountered in more than 4 decades as a biographer, and enabled me to write about the ups and downs of the Doc and Margot relationship. Moreover, discovering that Margot's second husband was Solly Hill was a bit of a personal jaw-dropper as well, because I knew that Solly was already in the Norman Calloway story. When Norman made his first grade debut aged 17, and the match began with Norm and his Paddington teammates taking the field while the legendary Victor Trumper came out to open the batting. Trumper's opening partner was none other than Solly Hill. So this was one of those classic small world connections that you sometimes come across as a researcher. Thank you very much.
Go this way.
Yep.
So many thanks to Ross McMullin. As I said earlier, we've got copies of Life So Full of Promise, further biographies of Australia's lost generation, and we'll sell them tonight and some online for people who are watching online. And Ross has brought some of his earlier books, which are here, so you can talk to him about that and to Anne and myself about the other ones. So we come to questions, discussion. We've got till the top of the hour, so we've got about 20 minutes. Just come back here, Ross. You do a huge amount of work, and you've now done, I think, about 12 case studies across the two books.
13, yep.
13.
About 12. About 12 is correct.
A dozen, sort of. A butcher's dozen.
I'm a historian. I'm a historian.
Okay.
Got to be accurate.
Yeah, you've done 13, yeah. So how do you choose them? I mean,
Yeah.
why them and why not?
Yes.
Why not a sort of a bloke from Bendigo who was a butcher who turns up and gets knocked over in the Third Battle of Ypres? Why not him? Why them?
Well, this is, it's appropriate to treat with respect people like the Bendigo butcher and others who died among the 60,000 dead. But this is, and it's appropriate that we as a nation give due respect to all of those who died, given our egalitarian and democratic traditions. It's appropriate to bear in mind, to have a focus on the collective, the numbing numbers, the 60,000 dead and all the maimed. But this project is self-consciously a little bit different in that it's highlighting that it was a matter of quality, not just quantity. Yeah? Quality, not just quantity. And so to get a Guernsey in this sort of project of mine, I'm not sure yet whether there'll be a third one, but it's possible down the track a bit. What I've got in mind with my model is that they have to have displayed outstanding, spectacular pre-war potential. Doesn't matter in what field, as long as it's something or other. Spectacular pre-war potential in something or other. They don't survive the war in my model because that's the lost generation. And so the first part of the story is establishing the spectacular potential. Middle part is what happened to them during the war, and then the third part is showing that they were a national level loss because they were so special, underlining that it wasn't just a matter of their immediate family being devastated, which of course I cover in the book, but it's about them being a national level loss as well. And so if they fit those characteristics or that model, then they're potential starters, Gerard, yes.
There's a question down there. Just a second. Okay.
Thanks very much, Brian Tyson. I really enjoyed your discussion. Just a question about how important is it that they're relatively unknown? Is that a factor in deciding on who you write about as well? Is it unveiling a discovery of a new person that we might not otherwise have known?
Yes, that does appeal to me. Yeah, well, that makes the task harder. And also another sort of criteria, Gerard, is that, answering your first question, is that I have to be able to tell a story about them some way or other. There has to be enough information from the wide spectrum of ways that you do research. If there's the Mackay brothers had letters home that are at the Australian War Memorial. For part of the war, Doc kept a diary. So that's obviously, terrific source material. Norman Calloway left no personal records whatsoever. I've got nothing in his writing at all, other than his AIF enlistment form. But during his cricket career in Sydney, at that time there were 7 newspapers reporting each weekend about that weekend's cricket, and so you get info that way. So basically I'll get info from wherever I can from a variety of sources to try and make the unknown more known. But I like the fact that they are unknown, and lost generation can mean that too. So it's lost as in died young, but lost also that we don't know anything about it. Yep.
Armin Hicks Ross, thank you very much for your presentation this evening. Australia was a very different place during the First World War, and I was wondering what you're hoping to say to the Australia today in these books and making these people who have been forgotten known.
I'd like to illuminate what the war years were like, because what I self-consciously do, they're sweeping, wide-ranging stories. So it's not just 3 blokes. It's Margot's big in it. Margot's sisters are big in it. Doc's whole family's big in it, all his siblings. I had a bit of an affirmative action policy going with Doc's sisters. Whenever they did something in the Bendigo papers, whipped that in and found a slot for it. So it's self-consciously attempting to illuminate what it was like, as you identified yourself. It was a very different time, and also the main characters do not deserve to be forgotten. So retrieving them is a very important objective for me. Yeah.
Ross, the First World War spawned enormous writing. It's still doing that from your point of view. It spawned poetry, memoirs, fiction. I'm reading a novel now that's straight out of Oxford in the First World War and whatever. I mean, it's still and it's a modern day woman writing this story.
I think
what
I know,
is it
I
about?
think I know that book. Pip Williams. Yes.
But what is it about the First World War that captured so much of people's need to record their feelings, their experiences, and it's very personal, a lot of this recording, and you're still doing it, and we're still interested in knowing about it. Can you give us some idea of what was the experience of the First World War that did this, so much more so than I think other wars?
Well, I have no doubt, I've been convinced for a long time that the First World War was the most influential event in Australian history throughout the 20th century, and influenced so much that followed the rest of the 20th century. So, and I think you could take that, you could extend that beyond Australia, obviously. So, but certainly as far as Australia is concerned, that's my strong view, and that has that unshaken perspective has prompted a lot of my work and storytelling.
Just as a follow-up to that, with this particular book,
Yes.
there was something about the First World War that changed a generation.
Yes.
And you seem to put your finger on it in terms of what we lost.
Yes.
We lost a lot in the
Well,
next war, but in this particular war, so what was it that, I mean, even the spirit of those fellows, with all their talents nowadays, they'd be finding a way out, not rushing to go in.
Absolutely.
Well,
yes.
what's the change? What's the difference?
Well, as the second questioner pointed out in his question, it was a very different time then. We had different values, different beliefs, and that prompted a lot of behaviours that we would regard as very different from ours today. And people wouldn't rush to enlist today in the way they did then. And
Except for Israel.
Pardon?
Except for Israel.
Well, I was
They came up very fast.
I was talking about Australia.
Yeah,
yeah.
Again, is there something there?
Is there something?
Loyalty?
Pardon? Loyalty. Loyalty, yeah. We were a lot closer to the British. A lot of migrants came to Australia from Britain just before World War One. A lot of them enlisted in the AIF. Yeah, quite a few didn't, but some did. And our ties to Britain were much more axiomatic than they are now, and or than is the case now. But it was more. It was not so much the rushing off to enlist of itself, but it was that the Labor Party was smashed. To me, it was poised before World War One to be. It had pretty good credentials to be the natural governing party for Australia.
This is over conscription.
And smashed, and yeah, just destroyed itself over conscription, and some have said blew out its brains, and wasn't the same for a long time. And there were wide-ranging effects on Australia, yeah, and most of them detrimental. And those consequences lasted for decades.
In your book, if I missed anyone, I'll just do this and I'll go to Ian. Just briefly, in your book, you've mentioned Pockley. He dies in New Guinea.
Yeah.
The second guy in Gallipoli. Oh no, he goes to the Western Front from Gallipoli, and the third one on the Western Front. So we're dealing with the Germans. And it's often forgotten. I mean, you know this. That it's often forgotten that Germany was a Pacific power. To what extent was that a motivation, as well as fighting for king and country back in Europe, that Germany had possessions in New Guinea?
Yes, it's an under-recognised phenomenon that what Brian Pockley was racing off to do, and those with him, to deal with those German wireless stations. The Germans had plans to use those wireless stations to actually interfere with naval traffic going north, which would have not only disrupted the sending of our contingents as soldiers, but also trade with Britain. And they were definitely intent on taking action to disrupt that. And the wireless stations were a key part of that. And that's why Brian Pockley and that contingent, the ANMEF, were sent up there so quickly.
Right, thanks. I enjoyed your talk, and I enjoyed farewell, dear people.
Thank you, Ian.
I tried to look up more about you, and all I can find is all the books you've written, but I didn't find much about you. How do you support yourself? Can you live by writing non-fiction books and selling non-fiction books in Australia? Because my feeling is it will be very hard to do that. Nearly every non-fiction book is written by either a journalist or an academic, and they write it for interest's sake. But can you support yourself as just a professional freelance historian?
I'm very glad to say that I've got a tremendously supportive wife, and she, my partner, has been very critical to the enterprise for a long time. I graduated in law. I was a lawyer, but eventually decided that I found history and storytelling more personally fulfilling than probates and conveyances. So I sort of drifted, without knowing exactly what I was doing at the time, but I drifted away out of the law. I was an archivist for some time in the National Archives, and then along the way I had, for a while, the job of the official historian of the ALP. So I was a commissioned historian, paid a serious salary, which was terrific. We paid off the house at that time. Yeah, you know, I mean, so it's been an interesting career in the terms that you were asking about. And I was a professional cricketer for one season while I was starting my PhD at a very suburban club. So I played I played district cricket for Paran and Melbourne Uni. But then after I did my knee, I stopped at district cricket level and got a job in the suburbs as a captain coach, and boy, that was a hard way to earn $1. They expect you to win matches, and I wasn't, I wasn't able to do that often enough, and I wasn't there for the following season. But that was an example of another earner along the way. That's why I mentioned that. Yeah.
So what's the answer to the question? Get married someone who's got some money, is it?
Oh well. I'm sure she's got better things to do than.
So finally, have you missed anyone? So what do you reckon you're going to do next? You've been
What do
here
I-
about 3 times now. You're going to come back again?
Oh, I'd love to come back, Gerard.
But what are you going to tell us about next time?
Well, I don't know, but Ian's question prompted me to confess that I had written the centenary history of the ALP called The Light on the Hill that came out in 1991. It's a long time ago now. I've been out of print just about 30 years. I think it's time it came back. People said nice things about it at the time, and it's overdue for a reappearance, I think. So we might have a crack at that.
Sounds good. Many thanks.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you.
So many thanks to Ross McMullin for another fine appearance at the Sydney Institute, and thanks to Ian McFarlane for the question. I want to know the answer to that question for a long. I never had the courage to ask him. Right. So there we are, and we've got true confessions today. Very interesting. So well done on the book.
Thank you, Gerard.
Life So Full of Promise. Copies here tonight. Be selling on. Don't walk around the camera. And well done tonight for a fine performance and a great book. And I must say, of all the historians I know, I'm not sure I know of anyone who does more work than you do. I mean, the work in your book is just phenomenal. You must, you either don't sleep much or you don't drink much, one of the two. Anyway, for tonight, many thanks. Well done. Okay.